Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Director of U.S. Education Sales, Worldwide Public Sector, Amazon Web Services, Anne Merrihew.
Good afternoon, everyone. It looks like we've got some people who are missing in here, and I bet you they're out there talking in the halls, because all I've been seeing all day are people connecting and talking, and it's absolutely wonderful to see it. So thank all of you for coming and joining us today. I'm Anne Merrihew, Director of Higher Education at AWS. It's so wonderful to be able to bring together all sorts of thought leaders and people who are learning about the cloud and how it's relevant for education in one place. Today we're going to hear, and over the next hour, you're going to hear from some really great presenters. And first we're going to have Richard Palmer, and I'm going to go ahead and click here, which they've done a great job. You're going to start seeing who all the other people are. But I'd like to just tell you a little bit about Richard. So Richard works for Ovum, and it's a market-leading data research and consulting business focused on helping technology companies and enterprise decision makers thrive in connected digital economy. Richard is a practice leader of Ovum's public sector team. He provides research to support clients across higher education, government, healthcare, and the utilities industry. He joined Ovum in 2015 after 15 years of working in higher education. He's held senior roles both at the University of Melbourne and Monash University. And at Monash, he was actually the interim CIO. Richard recently authored a white paper called Reaching for the Cloud. And it's about higher education's journey to leveraging the transformative power called cloud technology. After Richard presents a little bit, probably 10 to 15 minutes, about his findings from all the interviews when he interviewed many different leaders in higher education, he will be joined by 3 panelists for what we hope to be a very lively discussion. Will you please welcome Richard Palmer to the stage? There you go.
Well, they told me that I was going to get a late afternoon slot when I was preparing for this, so I thought I'd make it a bit more fun and align the journey for the cloud with the 7 deadly sins. So I hope you'll come along in a bit of a journey with me along here. So let's dive in. The agenda. Higher education is still moving to the cloud, and we'll have a quick look at some statistics and some other things that give us an idea of where higher ed might be. Then we'll move on to what's motivating the move to the cloud. And finally, in our research, we've sort of uncovered 3 general stages of a cloud movement or a cloud journey. So we'll be talking about those. But why we're doing that is you've been hearing from leading practitioners all day. But the reality is that everybody isn't at the forefront. So hopefully, through the white paper, which will be sent out to everybody who's participating after the conference, and this talk, maybe you'll find one thing that can help you move your cloud journey along one more step. So if everybody, this is a squeaky stage, I'm not going to stand there, if everybody gains just one thing from the talk and the white paper, then we're doing quite well. So here's some statistics for you. Only 30% of IT's application spend is in the cloud at this point, specifically at SaaS. The stories for infrastructure as a service and platform as a service are quite similar. However, the growth is quite strong. Now, quite strong is a bit of an understatement. Anything with a year-on-year growth of 21% is a skyrocket. But the reality is, from those kind of research statistics, that means that most universities still have an awful lot of traditional applications and traditional infrastructure in their operations. So the story is, how do we move from there to where we want to be, whether that's 100% in the cloud or somewhere else? So that's the story we're going to try to tell today. But an even stronger indicator of where things are heading is that our research tells us that about 60% of all development and test instances these days are in the cloud, which suggests that new development is firmly in the cloud. So, why is the cloud attractive? What's motivating the journey? And what are the major things that get in the way of people making the journey they want to make? And we're going to use the 7 deadly sins as a bit of a way to explore some of those issues. So these are the 5 things that we've found motivate the journey. Now, at whatever we are, 4 o'clock, if those of you who can still count will realise that there aren't 5 dot points. There are actually 6. And that wasn't a test, but the reality is that the 6th one isn't a direct motivator for a cloud journey, but it should be a motivator for almost everything we do in in IT. So transforming the user experience, creating new value for our institution needs to be the driver for everything, but it's one step further away than the direct things in the cloud journey. So let's have a look at some of these. But we come to our first sin. So greed. I thought I'd start with greed. Lust seemed to be just a little strong to be getting going with, so we thought we'd go with greed. And these lovely images were got from Creative Commons, and if you want to use them, the acknowledgement's on the first slide. But, and specifically when we get to lust, I'd suggest you look at that image because it's quite interesting. Anyway, greed's the selfish desire to have something just because you can have it. Cloud technology, for its own purpose, for its own sake, won't deliver you any value. So the moral of the story is pretty straightforward. Whenever you're going into anything new, make sure that you understand the business value of it before you invest in it. Coming from a technology shop, there are lots of very bright faces or bright minds who work in at least higher IT, higher education IT, and they love to play with new stuff. And that's great, but without application, it's a waste. So let's move on to some of the other benefits of motivations for moving to cloud. The first that we've noted is the faster innovation, and I think you're going to hear some stories hopefully from John Rome, who will be joining us up on the stage, and maybe Betsy can ask him, why is it that they keep winning the Most Innovative School Award every year for the last 4 years? 4 years. So if Betsy doesn't ask, make sure that somebody from the audience asks. And we talked to a couple of other universities along the way to just make sure that we had the story from the ground as well as what we're seeing from the research perspective. So, faster innovation, time to prototype. John and I, before we sat down, we were outside chatting, and he said it sometimes took 6 months to provision the server capability before you could even start building the capacity. I must admit, when I moved to Monash in about 2008, it took us an average of about 3 months, but I'm sure we could beat your 6 months by quite a while for some of the projects. So the idea that you can quickly commission is really quite an important mindset in something new in IT. Pay-as-you-go experimentation, not a lot of need for big upfront costs before you can even start on a proof of concept. Scale to production, again, cloud services, if correctly configured, often are much easier to scale because they've been usually designed to scale after you've gone through the prototype. But the most interesting thing here is that, as well as the cloud services, agile project management multiplies the value. So cloud services are great, but if you're using traditional project methodologies, you might not deliver any value to the business, to the university, for 6, 12, 18 months after the start of the project. With Agile, you usually are starting to deliver value 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, something like that. So it is the combination of cloud plus Agile that really helps with innovation. The second motivator is the desire to build something new that's smarter and safer than the past. So it's the set of technologies that are available in the cloud from folks like AWS that can allow you to build much smarter systems than were possible. And we've heard endlessly today, not endlessly, but quite a lot today about some of the AI facilities which would be, well, almost impossible to implement locally. So you build a skill these days rather than put up infrastructure. And a lot of the time, people say cost is the main reason for the moving to the cloud. Cost's a reasonable motivator, yes. Well-managed cloud capacity is very cost-effective. Yes, you do get benefits from redeploying staff who used to manage infrastructure into other more productive tasks. However, we believe that it is the ability to innovate which is strategically more important motivator for the cloud journey than cost. So that would be really good for Betsy to pick up and test on our panel later if she so pleases. So let's move on. We come to some more sins. Sloth. Sloth is a lovely sin. So missing the opportunity to go agile on your cloud journey really is going to stop, well, hinder IT's ability to become more business responsive than it was in the past. Putting off cloud using cloud native architectures, so designing old-fashioned systems and putting in the cloud just creates more legacy. The fact that it's in the cloud doesn't make it any less legacy than it was before. So when you're building in the cloud, build cloud native. Keeping a few services running in a data center when you're mostly cloud is a really expensive way to operate because you duplicate your costs. You've got to be still managing a data center, still doing infrastructure management while you've got the cloud. So moving the process through is really important. And clearly, there's only one moral for this story, which is the tortoise doesn't win the race. Lust, we've got to lust. Rushing in to satisfy any desire is almost always a bad idea. Now, you can put your own life story to that or not, but I've got more grey hair than I can see in most of the audience, and I can certainly put my hand up and say, yep, that's true. And rushing into a technology transformation without training and external support is also a very poor idea. It is not easy to get into the minds of everybody from the business through architects through to technology folks that the cloud has some different characteristics. It should be architect, built, run, and everything else differently. So I like to use the analogy of learning to fly a plane. There are not too many people who try to learn to fly an aeroplane without some book learning first and somebody sitting next to them as they try to take off and land the first times, because the takeoff might be all right, but it's the landing that's the problem. So finding some help so that you can do it right first time in the cloud is also really important. Now that might sound a bit like pride, but we'll come back to pride a bit later on. So again, the moral, act in haste, repent at leisure. Data is another really important reason for moving to the cloud. Insight from data is one of the greatest benefits of the current era. This is an AWS conference, so there's no difficulty saying that here, but everything from managing to getting the benefit out of data. So why is that especially true in higher education? Well, education is established or embedded in relationships. Now, it's not like a sales contract. Relationships are really important in education. Relationships are built on interactions. And if you have been watching Generation Z, and I haven't got my mobile phone in my pocket, but they walk around like this. They are socially connected all the time, and in their learning, the social and relationship aspect of learning is as important or more important than it has been for any generation before. So if we ignore as institutions the social engagement aspect, we're going to miss out on a lot. Interactions are embedded in the real world. Interactions and the real world generate many different kinds of data. New data can lead to richer insights. And new insights change the way we think, act, and organise. So there's sort of a little causal relationship from education all the way through to the use of data. And without new insights, we're bound to the ways of the past. And without the data, insights are merely opinions. So we need proof to be able to really change the way we work. Now, there have traditionally been three puddles of data which were looked at independently by three different groups of people. So transactional and instructional data was looked through by the institutional research people and managers and those sorts of folks to find out things like efficiency and course loads and all those other sorts of things. Engagement data was the world of the marketers and the advisors, those folks on the front line who are actually interacting with students and trying to convince everybody to get them over the line in either the student success or on board in the first place. And operational data was the world of engineers, of campus operations people, network engineers, those kinds of folks. Today, addressing a combination of these data domains yields far richer insights. And even more importantly, if we can present the analysis that we've got from that data embedded in the daily work of the person, so they don't have to go to a special analysis system or to somebody special to get an answer to a problem, the feedback loop between what I'm doing today and what I could do tomorrow is much shorter, and the reality is that people will change their behaviour if they see a better option in front of them that has evidence to back it. They're unlikely to change behaviour if they have to go seeking for it or it's an external program. So in-context analytics is going to prove to be far more powerful than separate systems over time. And finally, and this is the sell for the cloud platforms, there are powerful platforms for doing all this in the cloud. So, why am I saying this? Well, at this point, our research shows that only 20% of higher education has actually invested in data lakes and big data tools at this point, which suggests that looking at more than one pool of data is not occurring in more than 20% of institutions. And secondly, and probably even more importantly, that only 13% are actively exploring AI tools, which is the way that we're going to get the next level of value. Once you start to get to a big data pool, manual methods of analysis start to become cumbersome, so you need the machine learning element really to gain access to the information. So let's move on. The journey. Now, if there are any Monty Python fans in the audience, this slide's for you. If you're not Monty Python fans, then it will go totally over your head. So the first stage of the journey is what we call 1 foot in the cloud, hence the image. It usually starts with lift and shift. And in preparation for this paper, we talked to Notre Dame, who started their lift and shift program or their cloud journey in about 2011, so very early adopter. And they set out to get 80% of all their systems in the cloud within 3 years. I'm not sure we didn't ask them whether they actually got there in 3 years, but today's answer is 85%. So they have actually delivered to the promise. But the most interesting thing, and why I've included it here, is that the way they went through it, many organisations, as they start this lift and shift, get caught in analysis paralysis. They have hundreds and hundreds of systems, and they think it's a good idea to analyse the entire set before they get started. What Notre Dame did was to do a bit of triage. They had 3 buckets, they actually had 4, but that doesn't really matter all that much. One bucket was the easy ones, and the easy ones, they just got started. The second ones were the difficult ones, where they'd have to do a bit more work or a lot more work, and they put them into sort of a hopper and did them one at a time. And the third one was probably the most important and the least used technique. They had 90 systems which they classified they didn't need anymore, and they would seek to decommission at the earliest opportunity. And that's one of the secrets of any of these lift and shift, is not to take rubbish to the cloud. So the second thing that gets in the way here is budgets, governance, and procurement. Almost neither of those 3 are generally set up for agile or cloud. So moving from capital expenditure or operational expenditure usually gets you into trouble with the CFO, unless the CFO is a partner in this journey. Changing your staffing profile will get you into trouble with both the CFO and the head of HR. So you need to get that person on deck with you. And the lovely people in procurement, I'm not sure how many of you have great relationships with procurement people, but they're the kind of folks who like to do things by the rules. And when you're thinking of perhaps $1 million to spend over 3 years in the cloud, which is not an enormous amount for a largish university, they end up in a tender and all sorts of other processes which are perfectly good for selection. But then when they say, so what's your spend pattern going to be for the next few years? You say, I don't know, we'll spend a bit more tomorrow and a bit more the week after, because all of that is less defined in an agile world. And finally, the shift that tends to happen right at the start of the one foot in the cloud is the start of the shift from running infrastructure and operations to having the capacity to orchestrate infrastructure. And that's quite a shift for all the folks who love to have hands-on with technology. So there are several more pitfalls in all of this, and that brings us to our next sins. Gluttony. Almost every university I've talked to, and even mine, had bill shock somewhere fairly early in the process, because the ability to create infrastructure moves from a procurement processes, which is pretty ordered, and a fixed amount of infrastructure in your university, which when you've used up, you have to go out and buy another large chunk of it. So there's a natural control mechanism in infrastructure that you can't use more than you've got in internal infrastructure. With the cloud, you can dial it up to infinity, or 11 if you happen to be a fan of yet another interesting movie, and you can just start to spend money without too many controls, because the ability to expend the university's money moves from folks who have management capacity who sign off on purchase orders to engineers and developers who can click on an instance that they want for development or test or whatever. So you need to build a whole lot of vigilance and orchestration and technique to make sure that you are controlling that cost at the start. It is awfully hard to corral 1,000 instances that are sprung up overnight after they've happened than it is to create some good orchestration and some good processes at the beginning. So that can be a trap for young players. Pride. Why is this one here in this form? Well, it's to remind ourselves that any strategy, is only as good as its execution. So going from the no customizations, we have to have vanilla software as a service out of the box at one extreme, and no, we will do nothing that isn't in the cloud as another possibility. Those hardline approaches can be damaging to the CIO's reputation and the strategy as much as, oh, let's just do anything, which is the laissez-faire approach. So each of them means that working with the folks who have a stake in the problem to work through the right balance of straight out of the cloud, standard and specialised, needs to be carefully worked through. And of course, pride goes before a fall, and usually when you have a fall, there's good public kicking. That doesn't matter. CIOs are very robust souls. However, your licence to operate in the university, your licence to orchestrate change, equals trust. So if you lose trust, you erode your ability to operate. So the second part of this is cloud first, well on the way. Agile is usually part of the methodology and it's working through. So at the start of the journey, the effort profile is pretty much like that Nelson's column or whatever the equivalent is in the US, where it has a thick base and a small top. So the ability to be aligned well with the business is a small group, generally business analysts and folks like that at the top of the organisation. But as you engage with more and more cloud, the amount of infrastructure and the amount of work down the bottom starts to decrease, and the profile can hopefully turn to something like this. Of course, there'll always be infrastructure to be managed, but more of the organisation is business responsive, hopefully, in the IT organisation if you've done your work well. So, greater focus on the business. The IT skills mix will change. Less code and technology process and more business-focused process. Hopefully, because you've gone agile and you're leveraging all these things, you'll be faster to innovate. You'll have a greater component of service reuse, which is a good thing, architects tell me. And of course, your CapEx-OpEx balance will change. So also, your organisational structure will change. So from the traditional functional organisation, you'll probably start to build project teams, which is a good idea. And maybe you'll even go to the idea that you start to use some group-style processes for some of the governance functions. And because I'm short of time and they're not quite frantically waving me, I won't go into that. It's reasonably extensively explored in the paper. So change is painful. Some people will behave badly. They'll do non-rational things because you're taking away the things that they're comfortable with. So don't get angry, don't get caught up in fear, uncertainty and doubt, because an eye for an eye, meeting anger with anger just leads to a whole bunch of blind folks. So for the second from final slide, peer into the fog of the future. So this combination of fully adopted cloud platforms and agile methods is a really strong accelerator for innovation. It's the capability for innovation. Obviously, it has to be applied for it to bring value. So the things that we see out in the world are threefold. There will be more autonomous systems, whether they're advisor bots or self-driving cars in the future. So the joining up the gap between the virtual and the physical world will be a really important skill. So that's sensing technology, the cognitive technologies like machine learning, joining those together so that we can seamlessly work between the two domains. Quantum computing is just going to change the agenda, particularly in cryptography, because it'll break everything that we're doing now. And if we don't use the digital tools we have to manage the risk of the digital era, then we'll be left behind. So we're going to have to rethink audit, we're going to have to rethink the way we do cybersecurity, particularly cybersecurity response, and various other things to move forward. Which brings us to our last slide and the last sin, envy. Duplicating somebody else's cloud journey is sure to be wrong. So that's also a safe harbour statement. And that was a successful click. Let's try another one. There we go. So keeping up with the Joneses wastes your money on their dreams. And thank you for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO and co-founder EdSurge, Betsy Corcoran.
Hi. Thank you. Have a seat. Thank you very much. We are at the very final session of today, and I am going to be joined up here on stage by two terrific people. John Rome, please come up. John Rome, who is Deputy CIO. Big round of applause. Arizona State University. And Autumn Boswell, who is the Director of Enterprise Architecture for Western Governors University. Come on up. So as the voice from God said, my name is Betsy Corcoran. I run EdSurge. We write about education, technology, the confluence of these things, and the future of learning. And we try to keep it real. So our starting questions for these two folks, both of these gentlemen, all of these gentlemen, have done this cloud computing thing for a long time. We've heard a lot about all of the advantages, the opportunities, the great things that cloud computing can do. But it's hard, right? How many of you have actually implemented cloud computing in your organizations? Stretch. Okay, that's a start. How many of you are thinking about doing it? Nobody? Okay. Everybody who's done it has done it. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to try to talk about the lessons learned and the real elbows on the table lessons, experiences that we've had. So, John, I'm going to start with you. You have been doing this for a very long time at Arizona State University. Arizona State University has been doing cloud computing for close to 5 years. What do you wish someone had told you before you started?
Wow, this is great because Betsy didn't tell us any of the questions beforehand, so you can't really prepare.
It shouldn't be a surprise.
So yeah, I shouldn't be surprised. One of the things that we didn't expect were, you put me on the spot, Betsy. Like, wow, this is fun, but it's also like kind of nerve-wracking.
It's a little nerve-wracking. Well, I'll give you a hint. So John and I were starting to talk before about the fact that there's a big change that's gone on. When you go to your university president and you want to tell them all about cloud computing, you want to sort of explain, these are the great advantages, and they're probably sitting there going, yeah, but one of the things that you've discovered is the ability to show them, right?
Yeah. No, I think some of the challenges that we had was really the culture wasn't quite ready yet. We were lucky that we actually went with a private cloud first. So we understood the ability of the core versus context, the Jeffrey Moore concept of, I want to sort of give away all the context work. Who wants to run email servers? I'll give that to someone else, versus the core of how do we help with student outcomes. And so we knew that we needed to get out of those businesses. The problem is that a lot of these companies who are doing the private cloud now are like getting out of the private cloud business and saying, let someone else do it, like AWS. And so now we had to sort of refactor, how do we now then move into this public cloud environment? And so I think that was, in terms of some of the challenges, I think it really goes back to the culture. It seems like a lot of our operations folks, they like the idea of humming machines. They like the fact of like these warm machines, and they like to plug in things, and they feel that's what their value is. And in some cases, like, how do you get them to climb the value chain of, this is adding value, but you could be really adding value if you let someone else do this context work for you. And so,
what was the first successful kind of conviction that your group had? The first time that you were able to get them over that hump?
I think part of it is the ability to do something relatively fast. As I said before, it took us 3 to 6 months to sometimes procure hardware to sort of start a project, versus I could just now go and without any very minimal capital, I could go out there and just start up a machine and do something. So I think that was sort of the aha moments, that I didn't have to take that time to market of coming up with an idea and then doing something. It was like, wow, this is pretty great. I have an idea, and 3 days later, I can probably do something that's pretty cool. But then I realized then I have a lot of work to then go and really get it to like sort of an enterprise level.
Right, so we'll come back to that. But that ability to sort of show, not just tell, but show, which we journalists love, is terrific. And then, of course, you get to that great chasm, which is, oh my God, we've got to actually do it. So let's come back to that in 1 second. Adam, I want to take the same question to you. Adam helped bring AWS into the Western Governors. What was your first successful, like, yes, we got this project, we're going to go forward, and then what did you learn?
Sure. So first I want to address the guy in the back of the room who loves to keep those plugs into the server and the mainframe. We call them server huggers.
Server huggers. Okay.
Very, very important term. But, you know, I found that our first success was not actually our POC, right? So we started to come to AWS as a strategy, and the first thing that we encountered was exactly what John said, was culture. There was a lot of misunderstanding about what it was, how it was supposed to be interpreted. When I first joined Western Governors, we had had the previous opportunity to start to move into AWS, and it had been treated pretty much like a data center. And so everyone
And
had
what does that mean? So it was treated like a data center. So what was the cultural issue that had to be overcome?
Yeah, so the idea was, as Richard talked about, is the misconception of what cloud native means. And so everybody took the assumption that moving into the cloud just meant you moved from one data center to a magic data center in the cloud. You know, we found ourselves with hundreds and hundreds of EC2 instances that were not appropriate systems that we just started dumping everything into. And so culturally, when we started to make that second transition into talking about the actual use of being in the cloud and what that meant, we had a big cultural issue to overcome, because kind of had already had this feeling like we already moved to the cloud and it didn't work. It was terrible. And so our first success really came when we stopped and we started to look at things like containerization and ECS and using ECR and Fargate, these AWS tools that are provided for you. And we started to build systems that shortened our time to delivery, increased our ability to do governance and security, and allowed for us to immediately turn around and show the business that the investment that we had made was not only financially successful, but was successful for the culture, was successful for the engineering teams, and really provided an opportunity for us to leverage the power of having the cloud, right, of having these services available.
And how much of that, you mentioned cultural change, how much of that, as John was suggesting, and I think Richard alluded to as well, how much of that was really changing the development mentality from a waterfall development attitude to a more agile, a 2-week sprint, let me sort of show you this iteration?
So those were actually in parallel, right? We were starting to move along the lines. Agile programming, agile and Scrum mentality is something that, while coupled to the cloud, is not unique to the cloud.
But can you do the cloud well without it?
I don't think that you can do without the principles. Agile and Scrum, while they have pretty strict ideas around them, are really subjective words, kind of like DevOps.
Subjective words.
They don't actually mean a specific terminology. It's more of a concept or a principle that you follow. So no, you cannot succeed in the cloud without the principles that Agile identifies, and that is quick iteration, understanding of where you're going now, and the goal of where you want to get to without setting the determination from the beginning. You've got to be flexible.
And so John made the point that you can sort of show an instance of here's what I'm trying to do, but then starting to build out the plan of here's how I'm actually going to make this happen and make this happen at scale becomes really challenging. John, talk a little bit about what it then takes to go that next step, to go to the scale side.
And I think part of that really goes back to how do I find the talent to really help stand up these services at scale. And I think part of it, like, how do you do it? Do you train them? Well, does training really work when they don't really get their hands on? You know, is training sort of in place the better way to go? So I think part of it is really how do you get this workforce ready for this journey? And I think that's really some of the harder things that we had to do. And then we kind of stumbled along the way. We were cloud agnostic for a while, and so we were working in multiple clouds, and so that confused what we were trying to do, and there was camps of we need to go to this cloud versus this cloud. So it wasn't until recently with a new CIO who said, I don't want to be known for going to the cloud. I want to be known for leveraging the cloud. And he said, we're going to go AWS first. And I think that helped with a lot of clarity in our organization that now we're all kind of going in the same direction. And I think we're making, we now have a cloud acceleration team. We actually focus some energy of like, how do we really make this sort of leap of faith at a greater scale, and then set up processes where we can be much more efficient. I think that's been a really defining moment for our organization, those few things.
Right. Now, Richard, you talked about bill shock. And let's talk a little bit about bill shock. What happens as you start to do this transformation? What's some of the examples that you've seen of the difference between what people thought they were going to spend and what they wind up spending?
Yeah. So I want to tailgate on John's answer before, because one of the things at Monash we did a research cloud before we did our institutional cloud. And so we learnt a lot of things about creating instances that were knock up, knock down for particular research projects. And even more importantly, how do you create a workspace for researchers in the cloud that has all the tools they want that you can put up and pull down quite quickly per project? So what we did, and sometimes we wanted to duplicate those things. So we had this idea of when you have one person and a bright idea, you put it in a sandpit. You get the bucket and spade and you play with it and you make sure you contain the cost, but it's not very expensive. Then a couple of other people come on board and say, that's really, really good. So you move it into the hothouse where you curate it a bit, but you still don't have to worry too much about organisational governance. But then when you go to full scale, it's an engine room problem where you've got to have enough coal to build steam. Sorry, it's a very old engine room we've got here. But you've also got to have supplies of water and oil and all those other sorts of things, and robustness. But intentionally moving it from one place to the other and having some protocols to do it can really stop that bill shock.
So I want to ask both Adam and John, did you guys encounter this? So Richard's telling us, okay, if you can kind of, thoughtfully move it from one place to another, you can try to control it, but does that really work in practice? What have you found?
So, to be honest, when we approached our initial move into Amazon, we took a Amazon first kind of edict, right? We said, we're going to go all in. This is our solution. And we were fortunate enough to have seen some other people do it, including John, and what ASU had done. BYU was also a good person right ahead of us who had taken a lot of time, who had walked through, if you're familiar with the well-architected framework. And so when we began and we came on, we went in with, as much as possible, eyes wide open. And so while we had an anticipation of the shock going from development or sandboxes into full production with replication and geographical redundancy inside of AZs, all of that fun stuff that triples, quadruples, and multiple X's your expenses, we really didn't come across any significant unknowns with the exception of machine learning.
With the exception of machine learning. Okay, let's go into that for just one moment, and we'll come back to John. With the exception of machine learning. So why? What happened there?
So our first, we had pushed for trying to identify what our first AI ML product should be or project should be. And so we ran a whole bunch of hackathons. And it turns out training against a relatively small data set, we were running SageMaker at the time, came out to a reasonable expense. We then put something into production and 15, 16x'd the data amount that we were churning.
Ooh, okay.
Started to turn on some of the hyper processing of SageMaker, and that was a tremendous shock.
A tremendous shock. So 15 to 16 times the amount of data, and that
Yeah.
increased your costs by?
Not 15 or 16 times the cost. 30, 40 times.
30 or
Yeah.
40 times. Okay. John, take us through your experience. Again, you were earlier on the learning curve. What did you guys?
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly we had some sticker shock months, no doubt about it. And sometimes it happened where a researcher spun something up. And we had tools in place, third-party tools that you pay a certain percentage a month. We would see, like, all of a sudden a huge bill. And sometimes we found it was a research and it was not really ours to do. But we use the tools now and, again, eyes wide open about these costs. But then we have a secret weapon. You want me to tell you what the secret weapon is?
Tell us the secret weapon.
It's Greg. Greg. We hired Greg. Greg was an... Greg?
We have a couple of people nodding.
People know Greg.
Here.
But Greg, no, what happened is that we realized that, with the spend, it's a pretty significant portion of our budget, and we realized going forward, we hired Greg, who was a former auditor with a little bit of technology, not a lot of technology, but being an auditor, he can go out there and find stuff out. And what Greg did now, he's been in an organization a little over a year. He has paid for himself. He goes out there and says, hey, I see we can get some cost savings by doing reserve instances. John, do you realize we can do this? Nate, do you realize if we did this, we could save money? So Greg is our secret weapon. And I'm purposely not telling you his last name because I don't want you to hire him.
You can't hire him.
And he's really happy at ASU, by the way.
But he has a great title.
#1 in innovation, 4 years running. It's like a great place to be.
He has a great title, which is?
I call him a cloud economist, but he might have a more...
Cloud economist. Okay. So the first answer is find yourself a cloud economist, preferably one who has got a really good sense of auditing and keeping a sense of what's going on.
Named Greg.
Yeah.
I
lied there.
I would absolutely second that. So we didn't have that particularly. I came from a pretty rich background of understanding AWS, so I was helpful there, but I was not a Greg. I would absolutely say if you are new or you are moving into the cloud in general and utilizing that, that person is absolutely invaluable, right? Someone whose full-time job it is to identify costs, where you're spending, what you're doing, and AWS provides tremendous tools to help that person to do a really, really good job. It's absolutely worth it.
Okay, so the first thing we talked about were cultural changes, how you need to talk to probably the upper levels of your institution to get them on board, the value of sort of showing quick iteration and, oh, look, let's go, and the value of the cloud economist and actually making sure that you're staying on track, or at least as close to on track as you can, right? What else? John, again, you've been at this a very long time. Mm-hmm. What do you wish someone had told you before?
I think part of it is I wish someone had told it was a little bit harder, because you get this perception right away that I can quickly turn up a server and I can set up this environment and I can quickly show something really great. But then you start worrying about, well, let me worry about my connection there. How fast is that? What about security? Let me think about performance. Let me think about, there's all this thing that comes up with sort of this whole package. And in fact, we felt like sometimes we didn't have the expertise, so we used professional services to help us along the way too. So it was really that it's a little harder than it thinks. It's harder than it looks, because you get this perception right away, I can quickly do something, which is true, but then sort of setting up this as an enterprise level, it just takes time. But it's worth, I mean, the payoff has been tremendous. I mean, the impact of our institution and the art of the possible, and then really where the trajectory that we're going, it's going to help us scale and help us with our mission. Like we want to educate 200,000 students here shortly in the next, say, 10 years. Technology is the way to do it. Our president understands that, and we understand like cloud is just one way that it's going to help us get there.
Absolutely. What about setting goals? How easy or hard have you found it to be to set very clear goals, particularly with the upper levels of your organization, about why you're trying to do this, and then measure those goals? Richard, you're smiling.
I'm a great believer in there's no good IT strategy, because the only strategy a university should have is the university strategy, and everything else should be really operationalised. But coming to the point there, cost control, KPIs against how the money's spent.
Yeah.
There's been some really good work by CSIR, Carnegie Mellon, anyway, never mind. Over the years about cost models for IT.
Okay.
They should be followed. And the KPI I like is the amount of money that's moved from operations up to transformational change. So they have a 3-layer model. Operation, which is usually up to 80%, then improvement, and then transformation. If you can move 5% from operations to transformation, you've probably nearly doubled your transformation budget. The cloud and the technologies and agile, between the two of them, is one of the generational opportunities we have for doing that. There haven't been too many in the last while, but there's also an opportunity for great big money sinks in all of that, which we've already covered. So,
again, when we talk about transformation, that's a big goal, right? Adam and John, when your institutions are talking about doing this kind of transformation, again, how clear are the goals that are being set? Are you really, clear on the KPIs of student engagement, or how are you framing those in ways that you can really deliver that value, make that change that Richard
I mean, for us, it's very clear. We have 8 design aspirations. This is where we're trying to do as a university, in addition to our mission. So one of our design aspirations is really around student success. So we really focus, like, how do we make students successful? How do we make sure that it's great learning outcomes? And so those goals are, they're very clear, but they're also very hard. How do you improve retention? How do you improve graduation rates? That's all part of the equation that we have to do out there. So I think the university goals, like every time we do a project, how are we going to impact our how are we going to impact our contributions to society? How do we worry about student success? Those are very clear. But then within the organization, how do we have KPIs? And even though we're a data-rich environment, we haven't been very great on internal KPIs. And I think within the last year, with new leadership, that's been happening now. That I'm a data guy. All I think about is data and measuring ourselves. I like BI and BI. I want to know how much are we spending out there, what are projections, and it wasn't really built into our culture. And so this is, we actually hired a culture officer to work.
Culture officer.
Yes.
What is a culture officer?
And she's part of our leadership team. And I think part of the culture is really how do we get an alignment among the organization? Because with 550 people in our staff, we have a lot of strong personalities, and not everyone's aligned. By bringing in this culture person, that has really helped us as well. Of like, how do we have alignment? And part of that with this new leadership is like we now have KPIs that we can all work to, like whether the KPIs like how many servers do I need to get here, what is downtime. Before it was just always like an afterthought and sort of a nicety. Now it's like part of, we have clear 20 goals within our organization, and each one of them are pretty measurable. And we just got done giving ourselves a report card last week over last year's goals, and it was a little bit brutal in some areas, especially the data lake that I was building, a little bit behind schedule. But then we looked at some of the other transformation we've made. We've done a great job with our AWS relationship, building out a Kick. We have an amazing mobile app that we've built in the process. And then now we've stopped. Okay, now next year, what are our goals? Making sure they're measurable, and then we'll give ourselves another report card at the end of the year. So we didn't have that built into our culture.
Adam, were you able to build in very specific KPIs as a part of this transformation?
So,
or did it take a little longer?
We came across this same issue of really the goals that we're setting are focused on the university and are focused on our students. And so we really took the idea of creating what we call a North Star. We call it the North Star. That's actually a term I didn't make up. I know, it's a very good one. But we took this North Star idea, and the idea was centered everything around the student and the student experience and what the student is achieving, right? And so as an objective-based university, we're really, really focused on what our students walk away with. And so we took that as the center, as the nucleus of what we were building, because something that we identified really quickly is that no matter how fast we work and no matter how incredible we may be, Amazon's a little bit ahead of us. Just a little bit. And AWS's exponential growth of their services, their technology, the things that they're pushing out, make it so that it's almost irresponsible for us to plan a year ahead of what the technology is going to be that we're going to solve the solution with. So as a university, putting our KPIs around the idea of what the student experience is going to be, and then being very agile in what we're willing to use as technology to solve those problems, really is a quarter-by-quarter situation. So as John just mentioned, we did the same thing. We do PI planning quarterly, where we get together as a ed tech, and we sit down and say, what are we doing this quarter to solve the problems, and how does it align to our North Star? And so we try to evolve that annually, but the solutions that we come up from the technology standpoint, really we don't want to plan more than a quarter ahead, because Amazon's going to come out with SageMaker or something incredible that's going to extremely decrease the amount of time that we have to put into it.
Yeah, we realize, like all the time, we have to pivot. This is the great thing about Amazon, and then also not so great, is that we have to pivot all the time. We did a lot of work with Alexa, so it was a voice-only device, and so we did all this work. Well, then they decided to come up with a new device that has a screen, and we're like, oh crap, we have to now work towards that. And it's a great problem to have, but that's something we always, as Greg says, we have to really be ready for those changes and be ready to pivot and take advantage of the technology.
Which goes once again back to the very first point, which is the cultural transformation that has to take place with your leadership, really in conversation with your leadership, is fundamental, number one. Number two, what I'm hearing you say is, in addition to that cultural change, being really rigorous about budgets, really using the economist in the cloud or the auditor to really sort of help you. Number three, recognizing the technology is going to change faster, and so knowing that the key goals have got to still be about the core values of the university, student values, where are you trying to go with students, but then the last piece is making sure that you've been able to translate those down into KPIs that can be measurable and that people can say, all right, last quick question for each of you. What is the one thing that is keeping you up at night right now?
Innovation.
Innovation, what does that mean? What do you mean?
So I come from a rich background of technology, and I'm new to EdTech. John and I were just talking about this beforehand. In the technology world and in the startup worlds, innovation happens very, very quickly, and it happens very easily. I'll say that pedantically. It's not terribly easy, but I've found that being new to education, we are not the most innovative group out there. We have a lot of traditions. We have a lot of tendencies to hold on to how things have been done and how they want to be done. So the thing that keeps me up at night is really the idea around how are we able to make leapfrog innovations, not iterative innovations. I'm not talking about from a magic lamp to a projector. I'm talking major innovations that really transform the way that students are able to consume and be educated and take those educational skills into the workforce. And so that's the innovation that I mean around that is we need to make bigger strides.
Making that happen, and making that happen with our faculty, with our staff, which is another piece that we haven't had a chance to talk about. But John, what's keeping you up?
I think it's technical debt. We've built all these systems.
Huge.
And we have all these applications and servers that are in the cloud, and we have this. Do we just lift and shift? Do we have the ability to refactor them as we bring them there? And there's a lot of it out there. We have multiple databases, multiple applications, all these different platforms. It's basically technology du jour at universities. Like you name it, we have many databases. So how do you get to that path? And I think that's the thing that keeps me up. I know there's a lot of other things in the organization, but for me, that's like, how do we get there faster? And I have a legacy warehouse I need to move into the new data lake environment. And I want to just work on the new stuff, but then we have to sort of then bring along the old stuff because of that.
And remember which parts you're not supposed to bring along, as we talked about earlier. Richard, last thought, what's keeping you up?
Yeah, so having moved from a real job into more the consultant role, it's making sure that I can provide the right advice, not the advice at work yesterday, or not the general advice to whomever I'm talking to. The world's moving so fast that yesterday's advice is not generalisable anyway, but it's probably wrong for tomorrow. And your comment about the technology of tomorrow isn't even known today. So people who ask me for a 3-year technology, to help them with a 3-year technology plan, is just not a doable thing anymore.
Right. This conversation could go on for a lot longer, but you probably want to have a drink. I hope that you will join all of us in the lobby and continue to ask some questions of all of these folks who have a great deal of experience. Again, at EdSurge, we try to write stories about all of these things, and so you can always turn to us, both for some information and latest updates on everything that's going on. So again, my name is Betsy Corcoran with EdSurge. Please join me in thanking this delightful panel. Thank you.